Author and columnist Glenn Greenwald recently spoke about privacy, security, and government surveillance to an audience in Ottawa, Canada. He also talked about concerns of mass surveillance programs in Canada's surveillance agency known as CSEC. And following his speech, he took questions from the audience on former NSA contractor Edward Snowden, Canada's role in mass surveillance, and working with Canadian journalists to disclose information about invasive surveillance of Canadian citizens. Canadian freelance journalist Jesse Brown moderates this nearly 2-hour event.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Owen. I'm the organizer with a little help, or I should say a lot of help from Open Media and Rabble.ca, who've been absolutely instrumental. And I've done these things before, and these guys are just great sponsors, supportive, and helpful. A little bit of the history here. The reason I'm bringing Glenn, or part of the reason I'm bringing Glenn is actually a friend of mine. And I do believe in his message. It's an important message, particularly at this time in Canada. So I asked him to come to Ottawa. He wasn't planning on coming to Ottawa, and as a favor to me, he's come to Ottawa. So thank you, Glenn. So tonight, maybe you might be interested in how I met Glenn. Actually, I was commenting at Salon like years ago when Glenn first started. And it was a lot of fun. There was some great commenters there, and we would debate. And what was interesting is Glenn would always jump into the comments and talk to us and deal with us, and sometimes insult us too. Because there was people lived in dread of Glenn, coming down and saying, no, this is why, and just destroying you logically. So, over the years, Glenn and I would, exchange comments. I fed him some stuff, a couple stories. He mentioned me in his column, and I was like really happy. And, then eventually we started exchanging emails and things like that. And back in 2012, I brought Glenn here for the first time, and I've met him a few times since then. And, contrary to the image that you see on TV and stuff, a lot of people think Glenn is like this ogre. You see him on TV and he's snarling at people, and he's the nicest, sweetest guy you'd ever want to meet. And anyway, I'm not going to talk too much because I know nobody came to see me. I'm holding in my hand here a Rubik's Cube. Everybody here familiar with Rubik's Cube? Now, the Rubik's Cube is central to this story because when Glenn went to Hong Kong, he had no idea what Snowden looked like. Snowden did not tell him what he looked like. He couldn't because that would be bad operational security. So he told him, I will be carrying a Rubik's Cube, and that's how you'll recognize me. So when Glenn went into the lobby in the hotel in Hong Kong, he's looking around, like, where is this guy? And he's expecting like a senior NSA guy. And he looks over there and he sees little Edward Snowden, who's a tiny, skinny guy. And he looks about 19, And he's got the Rubik's Cube. And apparently that blew Glenn's mind because, what am I set up? Who is this guy? I'm looking for a senior NSA guy, and I've got this kid here. So anyway, long story short, they talked, and this is where we are. So we're almost ready here. Our host for the evening, our actual host, is Jesse Brown. Jesse Brown's a real journalist, unlike me. I'm just a guy with a big mouth. And he's had a lot of experience. He's worked at CBC and Maclean's, and he's currently got his own website called Canada Land. And Jesse's a great journalist, and Jesse's going to do an interview with Glenn after Glenn's talk. So Glenn's going to talk for 30, 40 minutes, and then Jesse and Glenn are going to come out and they're going to have an interview. And Jesse's promised me a very probing interview. He's not going to let Glenn get away with his stock canned answers, which we've heard before. So, that's basically the thing. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Jesse's going to come out in a few minutes, and he's going to intro Glenn. And before I go, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. I thank my sponsors again, and mostly all, I'd like to thank my wife, Enrico, for helping me. She's been absolutely instrumental. And also, turn off your cell phones and put them in the refrigerator out back. I don't know how many people got that joke, but it's a joke. So anyway, right now we've got Jesse Brown. He's coming out, and give him a big hand. Thank you very much for coming.
It's been a hell of a week. I was following along on Twitter as things were unfolding here, and amid everything else I was feeling, all of the confusion and the shock of it, and later the sadness, I felt something else. I had a selfish thought. I thought, this is bad luck. What bad timing that this had to happen so soon before the Greenwald event. And everything that I heard as events unfolded and in the days since has sort of affirmed that sense that the timing is off. You know, we hear these things. We hear that Canada lost her innocence on Wednesday. And we hear that we have to say goodbye to the old normal because now it's welcome to the new normal. And we're told that things just don't feel the same anymore. And all of this just gave me this, this growing pervasive sense that this was not the time for this conversation. And then I thought about some other things. I thought about Bill C-13. It was first introduced years ago as the lawful access legislation. Then Vic Taves called it the Protecting Children from Online Predators Act, and people were not so happy with that. And then it was rebranded and reintroduced to us as the anti-cyberbullying law. Whatever you call it, this is a piece of legislation that makes it very easy for law enforcement to call up your cell phone provider, to call up your telephone provider and get information about you, all kinds of information, without a warrant, which they do anyhow, but this would make it legal. And this is a bill that we've been beating down. 73% of Canadians oppose this bill. And privacy advocates and commissioners are against it, and the Supreme Court has ruled that it's probably unconstitutional. And we've been beating it back for years, and this week it passed its third reading in the House of Commons and is off to the Senate for a rubber stamp. After the shooting, something else happened. Our Prime Minister promised us that he would expedite tough new anti-terrorism legislation that will make certain kinds of speech illegal and will make it easier for authorities to detain suspects of terrorism. This is not a new normal. This is the old normal. We've seen this before. We have seen moments of trauma and fear that have come with them subtle messages that it's not appropriate to have certain conversations during those times. And we've seen before that while we're getting that subtle and not so subtle message that those conversations are not appropriate, our rights get curtailed at that exact moment. This has happened before. So seeing this auditorium filled with Canadians tells me that this is the exact right time to have this discussion. This is the exact right time to talk about things like surveillance and our rights. And I feel incredibly lucky to be introducing Glenn Greenwald in a moment. I feel very lucky that there is a Glenn Greenwald. I think about that, yeah. I mean, think about that. Consider for a second if Edward Snowden didn't have a Glenn Greenwald to contact, if there wasn't a journalist who would encrypt the communication. Imagine if the NSA had heard what Edward Snowden was trying to convey to a journalist. Imagine if the journalist that Edward Snowden contacted was not as committed to rigorously and aggressively but responsibly reporting the revelations that Snowden was brave enough to come forth with. Imagine, we would all be the worse off for it, we would all be ignorant, and I don't know where Edward Snowden would be. Glenn Greenwald has paid a price for revealing these truths. He has had his patriotism questioned, he has been called a criminal, or an accessory to a criminal. He's been called these things by journalists. He's had his boyfriend detained, he's had his freedom curtailed. But he is here with us in Ottawa tonight, and I would like a warm round of applause for Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Good evening to everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you as well to Open Media and Rabble CA for sponsoring the event, and thanks as well to my very enthusiastic longtime reader Bill Owen for organizing such a great event and for helping me be able to come this week to Canada, where I have had a very eventful 96 hours. It is actually, in an interesting way, I feel like I've had, despite how tumultuous it's been, a rather productive week, because I feel like I've accomplished something on my list of life objectives that a lot of people who believe the stereotypes about your country would say that would be impossible to achieve, which is I have gotten to spend the entire week with my email inbox full of enraged Canadians And there are a lot of people who would have said that that's just impossible to achieve, so it's something I get to check off of my list. The reaction to the article I wrote this week, which I wrote after the Quebec attack, but very shortly before news of the Ottawa shooting broke, actually did provoke among the most intense and polarizing reaction of anything that I've ever written. And in a lot of ways, I look at that as a sign that it was actually a piece very worth writing. Because I do think ultimately the role of journalism, especially at the most difficult times, is to question and challenge the assumptions that people cling to most fervently. And I heard from at least as many Canadians, who were supportive of the arguments I had made and who were appreciative of the fact that the debate ended up including those arguments and perspectives as I did hearing from enraged Canadians. And I think this really underscores an important point, which is that the events of this week, as tragic and horrific as they have been to watch unfold, really do provide the perfect framework in a lot of ways to think about all of the issues that I had long planned here to come and discuss. Those issues are ones that I've been working on for many years, but were really brought into vivid highlight by the work I've been able to do over the last 16 months reporting on the extraordinary archive of documents provided to me by my heroic source, Edward Snowden. And these issues pertain to the messages and narratives that Western democracies, the governments of Western democracies, have been disseminating to their citizenry in the post-9/11 era about terrorism, about threats, about the nature of our societies, and they pertain to all of the policies that have been ushered in as a result of those claims. And in a lot of ways, the events of this week, which I've gotten to see unfold firsthand by being here, are almost like a perfect laboratory for understanding how countries in the West have responded to these kinds of attacks and the policies and perspectives that they've been able to entrench as a result. The very first event that happened upon the first attack that I immediately noticed and recognized as extremely familiar and significant was the instantaneous injection, and by instantaneous, I do mean instantaneous, injection of the most inflammatory, but also the most meaningless word in our political lexicon, which is terrorism. Almost instantly, before anybody knew anything about the perpetrators of either events, the media and political class in this country and then in the United States and throughout the West all agreed by consensus that both of these attacks were adequately and even necessarily described as being terrorism. There was no discussion, as usual, of what that word means or what an act has to do in order to qualify. It was simply a label that instantly got applied almost reflexively, without any reflection or deliberation or discussion of any kind. And that word, as I said, is meaningless in the sense that it has no definition, but it's inflammatory in the sense that it's incredibly consequential. And it happens over and over again with these attacks, and I think it's really worth thinking about what that word means and the effect that we've allowed it to have on all of our thought processes as citizens. That was followed by the remarkable agility of how the Harper government tactically responded to these attacks. I am not a particularly enthused fan of the Harper government, But, you know, I think it's important to give credit where it's due. The speed and the aggression and the brazenness and the shamelessness with which the Prime Minister moved to manipulate and exploit the emotions around these events to demand more power for himself was, in a really warped way, almost impressive. I mean, I think you've got to give him credit. If you look at how other Western governments have responded to these attacks, they usually have the decency to wait an interval of 2 to 3 weeks before admitting that they're exploiting these fears in order to justify new legislation and new powers. But Prime Minister Harper is remarkably unburdened by those kind of qualms. It's amazing. I mean, less than 48 hours after the Ottawa shootings, he stood up in the House of Commons. This was yesterday, and this is what he said. He said, quote, "Our laws and police powers need to be strengthened in the areas of surveillance, detention, and arrest. They need to be much strengthened. I assure members that work which is already underway will be expedited." And again, the only thing unusual about that is the speed and nakedness with which it has happened, but this has been the process in the 9/11 era, where these attacks are instantly seized upon as a way to further dismantle core protections of civil liberties and core principles of Western justice. Another really visible and really familiar dynamic that I was able to see this week is what I often refer to as the too soon tactic. I had a lot of people who wrote to me, the Canadians who wrote to me, who said, look, I agree with a lot of what you've said in that article and what you've been saying in interviews throughout this week. I think it's important for you to say it, but I just feel like it's too soon. I don't know, apparently there's some kind of like time limit that you're supposed to wait before you start talking about these attacks in a substantive way. And while I understand the sentiment behind that claim, the problem with it is that there is no such thing as too soon when it comes to how the government and their allies in the media start politicizing these events. It was, as I said, instantaneous that it got labeled a terrorist attack, and that there were all kinds of claims, very debatable claims made based on the emotions that came out of these attacks. And I think if you're a journalist or a citizen, it's actually irresponsible to see these critical hours when citizenry is most engaged in an emotional and very riveted way, thinking about these issues, to cede that to the government and let the government messages go unchallenged. They don't wait before they start politicizing, not just the event, but even these well-intentioned emotional rituals that spring up around them. And I think it's worth talking about that as well. But the most significant part of this dynamic that I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about is the way in which we have been persuaded to think about the world in a drastically different way than reality ought to suggest. And by that I mean that we have been persuaded to think about our own societies and our own governments and our own behavior in the world that bears very little resemblance to the reality of what we've allowed our society and governments to do in the world. And to illustrate that as best as I can, I just want to share with you a little anecdote that involves Canada. The very first story from the Snowden archive that I was able to report that specifically involved Canada, I mean, all the stories involve Canada in the sense that they're all about the internet and we all share the same internet. But the very first story that I was able to report about surveillance from the Snowden archive that pertained to Canada was back in October of last year. And I reported this story with the large Brazilian television network Globo. And what this story revealed, it used documents from your version of the NSA, which is CSEC, the surveillance agency in Canada. And what it revealed was that CSEC had been spying on the communications of the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy, which, oh so coincidentally, just happens to be the agency in Brazil of greatest interest to the Canadian timber and logging industry. And when I reported this story, before I reported it, I knew it was going to be a huge story in Brazil. In part because they're very concerned about the way in which surveillance is being used to essentially cheat in the economic marketplace to gain unfair economic advantage. Also because it smacks of the kind of colonialism and imperialism with which that country has been plagued for so long by its neighbors to the north. But also I knew that while it would be a huge story in Brazil, I didn't actually expect it to be a very big story in Canada. And the reason I didn't think it would be a big story in Canada is because from experience, I know that when I've done reporting along the lines of country A is spying on country B, the country being spied on, cares a huge amount. But typically country A, the country doing the spying, doesn't really care at all. People care about the stories that show that they're being spied on. They don't care very much about stories showing their government is spying on other people around the world. And yet my expectations were completely thwarted once we did the reporting. It was a huge story in Canada. It led the nightly news, I think, 4 or 5 consecutive nights. I was deluged with requests from Canadian journalists to do interviews and to help them do further reporting. A lot of them did further reporting, and I was surprised, very surprised, at how much that story resonated here in Canada. And I spoke to a couple of Canadian journalists who I know pretty well. In fact, I spoke with 3 or 4 of them, and I asked them, why has this story become so big in Canada? This idea that Canada is spying on this ministry in Brazil. And they said, well, basically there are 2 reasons why the story ended up being so big. They said, number 1, there were a ton of Canadians, probably most, who didn't even know there was such an agency called CSEC. That Canadians just didn't know that they had an agency engaged in this very far-reaching and invasive electronic surveillance. They were watching the Snowden reporting. They knew the NSA did it. They knew the British had the GCHQ. But a lot of Canadians just did not know that there was an agency called CSEC engaging in this kind of activity. And then secondly, they said, and I found this even more meaningful, they said the self-perception that Canadians have nationalistically is completely at odds with what this story revealed. Essentially, they were saying, the idea is that Canadians think, we're Canadians. We don't do that kind of thing. We don't spy on democratically elected friendly governments for unfair economic advantage. And I found both of those points to be profoundly significant. I mean, if you think about the first point, the idea that there's this agency called CSEC that throughout the world engages in incredibly consequential behavior, which the very existence of which has been kept from Canadians, let alone the broad strokes of what they do. Think about what that means for the claim that we're living in a meaningful democracy. Whenever people ask me, and I get asked this all the time in interviews, what is the most meaningful revelation that you discovered from the Snowden archive? What I always say is, obviously, the threat to privacy posed by this surveillance, the vast amount of communications they collect every day, is very significant. But even more significant than that is the threat posed to democracy. It is stunning that these 5 governments of the Five Eyes Alliance, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, have instituted a system as self-evidently consequential, with such profound, far-reaching implications as a system of mass surveillance, without a whiff of disclosure or debate among the citizenries that are supposed to hold them democratically accountable. I did a story, I think, about 4 months ago, that came from the NSA archive. That was one of the most significant ones I think we did, even though it didn't get a lot of attention compared to the other stories. And the story was essentially about this magazine that the NSA publishes internally. They have like a magazine that's top secret. It's only for themselves, and it looks like every other magazine that you would buy at a newsstand, except it's really creepy. They constantly boast of all the wonderful ways they've invaded other people's communications, and they have little profiles of the technological nerds who have figured out how to break into somebody's email account, and they highlight them, and it's like Snoop of the Week, that kind of thing. And one of the issues that we had in the Snowden archive contained an interview. They do interviews just like every other magazine, and the interview was with the top official at the NSA in charge of foreign partnerships. He manages the NSA's relationship with the GCHQ and CSEC here in Canada and European countries and every other agency with which the NSA cooperates. And the interviewer asked him this question. The interviewer said, there's this incredibly strange phenomenon that a lot of us can't figure out, which is in all of these other countries with which we partner, you have wild swings in the outcome of political elections. Sometimes conservatives win, other times liberals win. You have the far right that can govern, you have the far left, and it almost makes no difference, the interviewer said. Nothing ever changes. Our partnerships with these other countries continues as strong no matter who wins or loses the election. Why is that? And one of the really fascinating things and unusual things about reading these documents from the Snowden archive is that you encounter this thing you never otherwise see, which is government officials who, when they're asked a question, actually tell the truth because they didn't ever think that anybody would know what their answer was because it was all supposed to be secret. And what this official said in response to that question to me was incredibly significant. He said, the reason these partnerships never change based on the outcome of elections is because there is almost nobody outside of the military structure of these countries that even knows that these partnerships exist. In other words, the people that we go to the polls and elect as our political leaders have no idea and never learn about the existence of these surveillance activities, and therefore can't change them because they don't know about them. And over in all of the countries in which I did reporting over the last 16 months, I constantly had top officials or members of parliament or Congress say to me, I was responsible for overseeing this agency, and yet I learned so much more from reading your articles that were published than I ever learned from the oversight committees on which I sat, or from the government meetings I attend. It really is, we've allowed there to be, it's almost like a state within a state. And the state that is within the state is one that has been completely removed from democratic accountability or from transparency of any kind. And that experience in writing about CSEC for the first time and the way in which it resonated here really underscored that for me. Think of how little we have learned prior to that reporting about the most, or one of the most, profoundly consequential programs that our government has implemented. And think about how genuine of a democracy we really have, how meaningful it really is if we go to the polls and pick the leader that we want if we have no idea what it is that they're doing. And of course, it's not just surveillance, but all sorts of other policies implemented in the name of terrorism that have existed beyond this wall of secrecy. And the implications for democracy are incredibly profound, as is our ability as citizens to understand what our government is doing. Now that leads to the other reason that they gave that I found even more fascinating, which was, although they were saying it half in jest, it was really actually quite true. This idea that, well, Canadians reacted to the story because it's inconsistent with their self-perception. We're Canadians, we don't do this sort of thing. Obviously, that perception was wrong. Canadians do that sort of thing. The documents we published demonstrate that they did exactly that. And when you think about what that means, that the reality of what our government is doing, on the one hand, is inconsistent with the perceptions that we have about our government on the other, that's another way of saying that the citizenry has been propagandized. That is the definition of that term, that they have been led to believe pleasant things about their government that actually is disparate to the reality of what the government does in the world. And this, to me, is the crux of the entire post-9/11 era and of the events that we saw this week. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that a little bit more in depth. I remember really vividly the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attack. I'm talking about like the days and weeks after the 9/11 attack. I was in Manhattan on 9/11. I had lived and worked there for 10 years, and so I recalled that experience and still recall it very, very clearly. And the prevailing emotion that was triggered by the 9/11 attacks in the immediate aftermath, not months down the road once the government began massaging the messaging, but the immediate aftermath was not one of anger or vengeance or sadness. It wasn't those things. The immediate prevailing emotion was bafflement, shock, and surprise. And the question that was on almost everybody's mind is, why would somebody possibly want to do this to the United States? Why would somebody have such hatred for Americans that they would be willing to blow themselves up in order to kill as many people indiscriminately whom they don't know? What kind of causes could have led them to that state, that mindset? And this was being asked not rhetorically. It wasn't a protestation of innocence or anything else like that. It was a genuine question. Most Americans genuinely did not understand the answer. And the US government knew that it had to provide an answer because everybody knew there was some reason. Everyone knew it wasn't random. The group that was responsible for it didn't put the names of all the countries into a hat and happened to pick out the United States. There had to be some reason, and the government knew it had to provide an explanation. And the explanation that it ended up providing was one that we now, 12 years later, can scoff at pretty readily, but at the time it's what huge numbers of Americans believed because their government told them that and the media told them that. And the answer was, the reason they hate us isn't because of anything we've done, Perish the thought. It has nothing to do with anything that we've done. The reason they hate us is because we're so free that they hate us for our freedoms. That was the genuine answer with a straight face that the US government and then the US media delivered to the American population. And what was so extraordinary about that, if you look back on it, is that it was not difficult at all to find out the reason. There was a long list of grievances that not only the group that perpetrated the attack, but a huge part of the Muslim world had been openly discussing for many, many years. You could have gone and read Muslim newspapers, you could have visited Muslim countries, you could have talked to somebody who was Muslim, you could have sought out any of that dialogue. And the grievances were all very clear, and they were all embedded into the culture for a long time. It wasn't just things like the US putting troops on what is perceived as holy soil in Saudi Arabia. It was much more substantial, things like imposing a sanctions regime on Iraq that killed several 100,000 Iraqi children, or overthrowing their democratically elected leaders and propping up the most heinous despots and tyrants, such as the ones that ruled Egypt and that still rule Saudi Arabia, or steadfastly supporting militarily, economically, and diplomatically the country of Israel as it engages in all sorts of violence against its neighbors in Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. This list of grievances was fully aired in that part of the world, and yet, remarkably, Americans didn't just reject the validity of those grievances. They didn't reach the conclusion that it didn't justify the attacks. They literally were completely unaware of the existence of that dialogue from that part of the world. They had no idea that their government was even doing these things. And that is stunning. The fact that for so long, critical parts of what the US government were doing in the world were simply suppressed in most US discourse, to the point where Americans literally did not even know the existence of it. If you look at polling data and other surveys of the Muslim world versus the Western world, and by the Muslim world I simply mean shorthand for predominantly Muslim countries, you find radical differences in how people in that part of the world think about things versus how people in our part of the world think about things. And we often like to tell ourselves that the reason for this disparate view is because they don't have a free press, and they're primitive, and they get misled, and they're propagandized. And there's all kinds of polling data that shows that if you ask people in that part of the world, as polling agencies has done, which countries are the greatest threat to world peace, people in that part of the world don't say Iran and China and Russia and North Korea. Overwhelmingly, they say the greatest threats to world peace are two countries, two close allies of Canada, which is the United States, and Israel. And so it may be true in some cases that sometimes what explains this disparate perspective in the world is that that part of the world is propagandized, but sometimes what explains it is that we are. And I think it's critical to accept that fact and to confront it. Nobody likes to think of themselves as living in a society that's propagandized. I think the most vivid example demonstrating how this works, that is a seemingly narrow one, but to me very powerful one, is one that happened in 2009. In 2009, this woman who is an Iranian-American journalist named Roxana Saberi was detained while in Iran doing journalism work. And the Iranian government said that they had detained her and then arrested her because they suspected that she was a spy. And she was imprisoned in an Iranian prison for 3 months until an Iranian court ordered her released on the grounds that there was no evidence to justify her detention. And during that 3 months, when she was imprisoned in an Iranian prison, her cause, her case, was one of the most celebrated cases in American media circles. Almost every prominent journalist would go on Twitter every day and say, "Free Roxana." They would report on it at night. They would demand it. There was all this outrage over the idea that, look at Iran. They're a country that's so tyrannical, they actually imprison journalists. And there was indignation and horror over what they had done. And the same thing happened a few months later when North Korea imprisoned for a short period of time 2 American Korean journalists and then ended up releasing them when Al Gore went in and visited. Huge amounts of attention paid, huge amounts of anger and indignation that a country could be so tyrannical as to imprison journalists. At the same exact time that all of that was happening, the United States government had been imprisoning over 24 journalists as part of what it calls the War on Terror, including the case of somebody named Sammy alHaq. Sammy alHaq was a Al Jazeera photojournalist and cameraman who was arrested and detained by the US government when he was crossing into the border of Afghanistan to cover the war for Al Jazeera in late 2001. And he was taken first to Bagram, the prison in Bagram in Afghanistan, and then shortly after he was taken to Guantanamo, where he remained for the next 6 years without being charged with any kind of a crime, given no due process of any kind, where he was interrogated overwhelmingly about his work for Al Jazeera and almost none about anything to do with terrorism or Al-Qaeda. The reason that's so amazing is because the words Sammy alHaq were almost never mentioned in American political discourse. To this day, Americans have no idea that their government imprisoned 24 journalists as part of the War on Terror, or kept an Al Jazeera photojournalist imprisoned in Guantanamo for 6 years without any kind of trial. In fact, I once did a Nexus search where I looked up the word Roxana Saberi and found the number of mentions during that 3-month period, just 3 months, when she was detained in an Iranian prison, and it was something like 8,000 mentions in American media accounts of her name. If you search the name Sammy alHaq for the 7 years that he was kept in Guantanamo, it is less than 100. I think the number is something like 71. Americans have no idea who he is. In the Muslim world, however, Sammy alHaq is a huge celebrity. When he was released, it was major headline news all over that part of the world. People in that part of the world know that it isn't just Iran and North Korea, which imprisons journalists, but also the United States that does so. It's we in this part of the world from whom that has been largely kept. And this disparity between what our government is doing in the world and what we actually ourselves are aware of, I think is central to so much of what has gone wrong in the post-9/11 era. And all of this was the backdrop for what I watched this week in Canada. And what prompted me, it was the main impetus for me to write the article that I wrote. And I remember the moment that I decided that I had to write about this. I was reading a newspaper account of the attack in Quebec, and I was simultaneously watching a Canadian television program about it. And the theme of both the article and the television show was the same. The theme was this. It was, people are stunned that this kind of violence could take place in such a peaceful community like the one where it took place. And I remember thinking that on some level that's really appealing to believe that that's true. It is, of course, true that the community where that attack occurred is relatively peaceful. And if you walk around Canada, as I've done many, many times over the past 5 or 6 years in many cities, it seems like a really peaceful country. It is a really peaceful country when you walk on Canadian soil. All of that is really true. But what isn't true is that the foreign policy of Canada is peaceful. The foreign policy of Canada is not peaceful. And I say that not judgmentally or in denunciation. I'll get to that in a minute. For the moment, I say that only as a literal observation of fact. I think a lot of times I've seen Americans who come and speak to the Canadians like to kind of play up these stereotypes and flatter Canadians by saying our government is really militaristic and warlike, especially under the Bush administration, and we so wish we could be more like you, this kind of nice, tranquil, diverse, peaceful country. And there is an extent to which that's not entirely mythical. Just from the Obama administration alone, in the last 6 years under President Obama, this to me is one of the most extraordinary statistics that I've heard. In the last 6 years, just under President Obama, who, by the way, won the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize, the United States has dropped bombs on seven different predominantly Muslim countries. Syria is now the 7th, in addition to a Muslim minority in the Philippines, which is really 8 countries that have been bombed just since the inauguration of the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize winner. Now, Canada has not been a party to all of that. Canada often refrains from some American aggression, most notably and commendably. Largely, though not entirely, refraining from participating in the war in Iraq. But Canada is a steadfast ally and partner of the United States in all kinds of militarism and violence. Years of invasion and occupation in Afghanistan, a bombing campaign of Libya that left that country in utter and complete shambles, and now what the Canadian press itself is calling a new war in Iraq, which has already spilled over into Syria. Now, you may have a lot of different views about all of those policies. You may believe that those policies are charitable acts of nation-building generosity. And maybe they are. That's a debate that people can have and have had. But there is a huge part of the world, hundreds of millions of people, that regard those wars much, much differently. They see them as acts of aggression and militarism. They see the innocent children and the women and the innocent men who are killed continuously by those policies, on top of which the participation of Canada in things like surveillance or rendition, literally picking up people from around the world, including in one case your own citizen, and sending them to the world's worst regimes to be tortured. You cannot be a country that lets your government engage in militarism and violence and that kind of radicalism and aggression in multiple countries around the world year after year after year, and simultaneously have the expectation that there will never be any violence brought back to the country perpetrating that. And this is not some radical left-wing doctrine that I invented. This concept of what is called blowback has been CIA doctrine for many decades. The idea that if a government engages in military action in a different country, in a different sovereign country, maybe it's not justifiable, but it is inevitable that violence will be brought back to that country. There is this remarkable 2004 report that was commissioned by the George Bush Pentagon, run by Donald Rumsfeld. And it was given to the Defense Task Force. And the question that Donald Rumsfeld commissioned that task force to ask was, what is ultimately the cause of terrorism? Why are there so many people in the world that want to do violence to the United States? And you can go online and read it. It seemed as though what I wrote this week or what I said in interviews was somehow controversial. It isn't. It is self-evident. The report in 2004 concluded this. This is what it said. It said, the key cause of terrorism aimed at Americans is, quote, American direct intervention in the Muslim world. American direct intervention in the Muslim world. It then identified 3 different policies that comprise this direct intervention. One is support for the region's worst tyrants, giving economic aid and drowning in weapons the regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Secondly was steadfast support for Israel, which is viewed as enabling all sorts of aggression in that part of the world. And third was actual wars and occupations, principally the invasion of Afghanistan. Canada plays a role in all of those policies. And what the report concluded, and this is not me saying this, this is an actual quote, it repudiated the US government's statements to its own citizenry in the wake of 9/11 about why the 9/11 attack happened, why terrorism happens. This is what it concluded, quote, Muslims do not, quote, hate our freedoms, end quote, but rather they hate our policies. It is so tempting to see ourselves as victims, as pure and innocent victims. It is. We all want to see ourselves that way. We get to emancipate ourselves from any kind of responsibility or culpability or guilt. It's really tempting to say, when our societies are attacked rather than our societies doing the attacking, that the reason it happens is because there's this extremist religion in the world, or an extremist version of a religion that's just unbearably hateful and irrationally savage, and they just want to do violence for its own sake. They hate us for our freedoms. That just simply isn't the case. And I think it is our responsibility as citizens, and certainly as journalists, to make certain that the dialogue isn't comfortable or flattering. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to make it as rational and fact-based as possible so that we're not actually susceptible to manipulation. So I just want to talk about one other point. about the events of this week and how critical I think it is in this dynamic. And this is actually a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, but again, I think it's probably a sign that it's really worth talking about. I have spent, I think, 3 or 4 days now, like everybody else in this country, watching unbelievably difficult to watch footage of the family members of the 2 soldiers who were killed, one in each of the attacks. And I've learned their names, and I've learned what their life aspirations were. I've seen their parents grieving on the screen or their siblings. It is incredibly horrific and emotional and tragic to watch, and I've gone through that exact same thing with all other Canadians. But the thing that I find very significant about that, and we should be focused on the victims that way, but what I find really significant about that is that over the past 12 years, my government especially, but also yours, has done all kinds of things that has resulted in the horrific deaths of innocent people throughout the world. Thousands of children, women, and innocent men. And I would be willing to bet almost anything that over 99.9% of Americans and 99.9% of Canadians are completely incapable of identifying the name of a single one of those victims. We know nothing about the life aspirations of the people that our government, whose lives they end. We don't hear from their grieving mothers or their grieving siblings. They are literally disappeared from our public discourse. And in some sense, this is just natural human behavior. We care more and pay more attention when our neighbor down the street, whom we know really well, gets killed in a car accident than we do if someone thousands of miles away who we don't know is killed. That's just, in some sense, natural human interaction with the world. But when it comes to public policy, it's a really dangerous thing to have that kind of a one-sided perspective on the world. That is what then leads us to believe that there is this ideology out there that's evil and savage and kills innocent people in the most horrific and tragic ways, and we are nothing more than the innocent victims who are the bystanders of it because we allow ourselves to suppress the implications of our own actions and the things that cause it. So I think the reason that, for me, it's so important to talk about these things is twofold. One is that I think we become much more susceptible to the kind of fear-mongering that the Canadian government is already engaged in, that Western governments uniformly engage in, to manipulate our emotions, to get us to acquiesce to things like what Prime Minister Harper calls greater police powers of surveillance, detention, and arrest. There's even talk that the Conservatives in Parliament want to introduce a bill to criminalize anything that is perceived as endorsing or legitimizing terrorist attacks, something that was particularly alarming for me because although I didn't actually say it, a lot of people falsely claim that I did, that I was justifying and legitimizing the attack by talking about the things I'm talking about tonight. That's pretty extreme and pretty radical. We become more susceptible to that kind of manipulation when we don't face the reality of what our own governments do. But the more important reason to confront these facts, I believe, is because it's really easy to look back at past generations and to make judgments and condemnations about what they did and the reasons why they made all kinds of evil choices, and to have clarity about the path that they embarked on. And it's extremely difficult to do that to ourselves. But I think it's worth trying to imagine what the next generation or future generations will think about what it is that we're doing. And I think it is undoubtedly true, uncontrovertibly the case, that future generations will look back, certainly at the United States, but also its key allies, and say that in the wake of 9/11, the US and its allies embarked upon a path of endless war. They put themselves in a mindset and in a policy approach that guaranteed not a long war, but a war that had no end. And the reason I say that is because the pattern of what has happened is so clear over 13 years and so clear this week, which is we do something in that part of the world that generates all sorts of rage and fury, rightly or wrongly. That rage and fury causes a tiny percentage of people in that world to want to bring violence back to us. When violence is brought back to us, we immediately demand that our government further erode civil liberties and engage in even more militarism, which in turn inflames that part of the world more and causes more violence to be brought back to us in a never-ending spiral. How do people think we're ever going to be able to get off that path if each time one of these attacks happens, our reaction is the same? And I think there's just two critical points we're thinking about in terms of that process. One is that the mere existence of a successful attack is not evidence that government policy was flawed. The mere existence of a terrorist attack doesn't show that the government should change its policy. You could have the most perfect government policy, the perfect calibration of privacy and security, or freedom and security, and still have terrorist attacks. You cannot have a society in which absolute safety is the goal. It isn't achievable, and trying to achieve it will create so many worse harms than the failure to have it in the first place. We allow that all the time. When we see a fatal car accident, we don't start immediately demanding that our government lower the speed limit or change its policies. We accept that in exchange for the benefits of having automobiles, we're going to have the risk of death, and sometimes people are going to die. It's intrinsic to the process, it's unavoidable, and it can't be solved. We don't demand that the speed limit be reduced to 3 miles per hour in order to avoid fatalities. We should be thinking the same way about terrorism. This is the crucial fact. Even after this week, and even if there are weeks and weeks more of weeks like this one in the year ahead or the 2 years ahead, if you are a Canadian citizen, if you're Canadian, you have a greater chance of dying by slipping in the bathtub and hitting your head on the cement or getting struck by lightning than you do dying in a terrorist attack. That's just factually the case. And yet we've allowed this word terrorism to take on such profound meaning that right before our eyes, governments dismantle the core protections, the defining attributes of Western justice in order to keep us safe from it. And I think it's critically important not to reflexively act that way every time there's an attack. But the last point I just want to leave you with is this word terrorism itself. Because in all the things that I've written about over the last 10 years, every single issue, from torture to indefinite detention to killing people whose names you don't even know with drones to massive government secrecy to all kinds of pervasive mass surveillance, the government and its defenders use one word over and over to justify everything that they do, and that is the word terrorism. They just utter the word and expect, often reasonably, that it will end the debate in their favor. It is the most consequential word in our political vocabulary. And what's really amazing about that fact is it is simultaneously a word that does not have any fixed meaning. You cannot provide any definition of terrorism that will then lead to a consistent application. You cannot find scholars who can give you what that definition of that word means. There's a famous Supreme Court case in the United States where the Supreme Court justices grappled over the word obscenity, because pornography in the United States is legal, but obscenity isn't. And the Supreme Court justices had to define obscenity. When does something cross the line from pornography to obscenity? And this Supreme Court justice very famously said, well, all I can say about obscenity is I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, which is a really kind of alarming way for our First Amendment freedoms to be defined, based on this kind of tingly sensation in your stomach about what this phenomenon is. That is the same way that terrorism is talked about. I mean, it was remarkable, the incident in Quebec, according to the government's own version of events, the perpetrator of that crime waited for 2 hours in his car in order to find a soldier in uniform and attack that soldier. Now, whatever terrorism means, and it's impossible to define, but the one common usage that it typically has is it requires the deliberate targeting of civilians with violence for political ends. And yet here is somebody who seemed to have deliberately avoided targeting civilians and targeted a soldier instead. Clearly illegal and unjustified. This was not a soldier deployed in war. But how, in what sense is that terrorism. Or if you have somebody like the Ottawa shooter, who very likely, although we don't know, seems to be driven at least by mental instability as much as religion or ideology, in what sense, if that turns out to be the case, is that terrorism? I think what this really shows is that the word terrorism, as significant as it's become, really has no meaning other than violence engaged in by Muslims against the West. It's really just a term to legitimize the kind of violence that we do ourselves and to delegitimize the violence that is used against us. And when you think about it in that way, it should have far different consequences than it has now when it comes to be applied without anybody really thinking about it, what it is. So the last point I just want to leave you with fully, and then I'll talk to Jesse, is not quite about the events of this week directly. It's actually about the last year and a half of work that I've been able to do with Edward Snowden. And I just want to share with you one particular lesson that I learned from the last year and a half that I try and impart to everybody wherever I go and whatever I'm speaking about, because to me it was a really profound lesson. It's something that'll influence me for the rest of my life. When I first talked to Edward Snowden, the very first conversation that I ever had with him was online, and I knew nothing about him. I didn't know his name, I didn't know how old he was, I didn't even know in which agency he worked. But what I did know was that he had claimed to have an enormous amount of extremely sensitive material from the most secretive agency of the world's most powerful government, and that he wanted to give that to me. And usually when you have somebody who comes forward, even with a tiny fraction of what he had, to give you information that the law says they're not allowed to give you, they want to hide, they want to be protected, they want to remain anonymous because they fear the consequences of being discovered. Edward Snowden said exactly the opposite thing to me. He said, I don't want to hide. I don't intend to hide. I intend, once I give you this material, to come forward into the world and publicly identify myself as the source, and to explain to the world why it is that I did what I did, and to explain my reasoning and motives of why I think it's the right thing to do. He said, I do think it's the right thing to do, and therefore I don't feel a need to hide. And when I got to Hong Kong, I remember before I got there, I had this mental image of what he's like. I'm sure you've all had that experience when you interact with somebody only on the internet. You develop a mental image, and it's never, ever anything like what they're like when you finally meet them. I thought he was in his 60s or 70s. I get to Hong Kong, and there's this kid. You know, he's 29, he looks 6 years younger. He looks like sort of any kind of a computer geek that wanders the mall or is in a college laboratory. And I spent a lot of time with him trying to understand his motives for why he would want to unravel his life and come forward, knowing that it would probably mean that he would go to prison for the rest of his life. And what I finally understood about those motives was that he had discovered something that he believed was a profound injustice, and knew that he had the ability to do something about it. And what he said to me was, if I confront this injustice and know that I can do something about it and decide not to, that will produce severe pain. I will have to live with that on my conscience for the rest of my life, and the pain of having to do that is so much worse, he said, than anything the US government could do to him, including putting him into prison for decades. And the reason why that is so stunning to me, and why it has so profoundly affected how I look at pretty much everything, is because Edward Snowden is the most ordinary and unremarkable person you will ever meet. He came from a lower middle class background. His father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He grew up without a shred of position or power or prestige. And even once he decided to do what he did, he was just toiling away in obscurity in this massive national security corporation. And yet, through nothing more than an act of conscience and a fearless commitment to the political principles that he said he believed in, he changed the world. He did. He literally changed the world. He transformed how hundreds of millions of people around the world think about a vast array of issues. He radically altered the debate about who we are and what kinds of rights we have in the digital age, and the relationship of individuals to the state and to states to one another, and the role of journalism in society. All kinds of implications, some of which we know, most of which we probably don't. And one of the things that I have encountered from the first moment that I began writing about politics 10 years ago, not just in other people but myself, is this kind of temptation of defeatism. Like, it's very easy to look at all these policies and all these complexities and to say to yourself, the institutions that are responsible are so enormous and so powerful that there's nothing that I as an individual can possibly do to change it. It's kind of a mindset of resignation that in some sense is almost pleasant because it relieves you of the obligation to act. And yet there's so many examples throughout history of really ordinary people, powerless, ordinary, unremarkable people, engaging in similar acts of conscience, whether it's Rosa Parks refusing to sit at the back of the bus and sparking this unbelievably significant civil rights movement, or a Tunisian street vendor setting himself on fire in protest of tyranny and sparking a regional conflagration against the world's most entrenched tyrants. I think the critical lesson that I know I've learned from working with Edward Snowden, that you see from so many of these other examples, is that any institution built by human beings, any institution built by human beings, no matter how formidable or powerful it seems, can always be attacked and reformed and changed, or even destroyed and replaced by even the most ordinary human beings, as long as the will and the conviction and the passion is there. And to me, that is a critical lesson to keep at the forefront of all of our minds all the time. So with that, I thank you all very much, and we'll now have this discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Pour you some water?
Sure, thank you.
So we're going to have a conversation for a while, and then we're going to turn it over to some questions from the crowd. There are microphones. There's a microphone here. I think that, and another one in the back? Okay. So we'll start a lineup towards the end of our conversation. I'll give you a word. Thank you, Glenn. It's true that Canadians were shocked to learn that we were spying on Brazil for industrial purposes. But we were not shocked by the revelations, or we were not shocked enough to learn that we had welcomed the NSA here during the G8 and G20 to spy, or that CSEC had been spying at some unnamed airport and elsewhere through Wi-Fi connections. Maybe that's just because we're Canadian and it seems really impolite to spy on Brazil, and that's embarrassing to us in a way that our own government, what they're doing here, is not. I've heard that theory. I've heard other theories covering this stuff for a number of years. I've heard that, you know, we're not like Americans who are really adamant about their rights. We're more deferential to power. And that's why the reaction here has been muted, whereas in the United States, your revelations with Edward Snowden have prompted the president to actually modify, whether that's meaningful or not is another question, but actually had to regard this and modify. And so we get in this discussion about the Canadian psyche. And I am screaming throughout all of this at the top of my lungs, we don't know as much as they do. They know about Verizon, they know about PRISM, and we don't know in any conclusive terms whether or not our spy agency, whether or not our government is spying on us. And you do know something about that. You know more about what our government is doing, and doing in our name, and maybe doing to us, than anybody in our audience here today. So there are many questions I have for you, but there's no question before this question. Is CSEC spying on Canadians?
Well, we've already done stories, a story in particular that demonstrates that the answer to that question is yes, and it's the story that you referenced, which is the story of CSEC tracking people who land at international airports in Canada and tracking them as they leave and use Wi-Fi connections and cyber cafes and the like, which includes Canadians. I think it's also important to understand that there really is no such thing as Canadian spying. Canada spies as part of the Five Eyes Alliance. And this alliance is notable principally because of how indivisible it is. So whatever reporting we've done about the NSA and about GCHQ necessarily includes Canada as well. I do think it's important to realize that Edward Snowden was working inside of an American surveillance agency. And so the vast bulk of the documents he took were not documents about CSEC. They were documents about the NSA and the GCHQ. There already is information about CSEC doing exactly the kind of spying they've long denied, which is spying on Canadians on Canadian soil. And there will be more reporting on those questions to come. I mean, the reporting is complicated. You have the responsibility to do it right and to make sure that what you're reporting is accurate. And we're being careful in that regard. But we're also reporting it as quickly as we can. And all I can say is there are very significant revelations left to report about Canada.
I think that the difference when it comes to what happened with the NSA is that the message to Americans was Verizon, the companies that you communicate through all the time, are indiscriminately spying on massive amounts of people, bulk surveillance. And I think that here we had a situation where people were able to say, well, I don't even know what airport that was. And then we had the government equivocating, oh, it's metadata, and metadata isn't data, it's data about data. And then we have CSEC saying, well, it was just an exercise. And then we have the CSEC commissioner saying that no laws were broken. So it is highly consequential if information is revealed that makes it undeniable that CSEC is spying on Canadians, because they are forbidden by law from doing so. So is there anything you can tell us about whether we can anticipate that kind of revelation?
I mean, first of all, what I would tell you is that you need your own Edward Snowden. You need a Canadian Edward Snowden who is inside of CSEC or the Canadian National Security Apparatus and takes the documents that you're eager, understandably, to look at and makes them public through journalists or through some other way. So I hope that happens.
And let me just interrupt to say that if you're out there, Canadian Edward Snowden, Canadian journalists now come, some of us, with PGP.
Right. JesseBrown@gmail.com or whatever it is. But, I mean, I think that, I actually do think that one of the most consequential aspects of the Snowden reporting is that he will inspire other people, not just in the US, but in partner countries as well, to come forward. I've learned the lesson a long time ago that I'm not going to preview the reporting that we're doing, because what ends up happening is if I sit here and preview reporting and I say, yes, we have documents that show X, Y, and Z, from the time that I get back to my hotel room until the day that I die, I'm going to be deluged with emails and tweets saying, well, where are these documents? On top of which, you go through the reporting process for a reason. You want to make sure that what you're reporting is true. So I'm going to wait for the reporting to happen. All I can tell you is that there is, as you know, stories in the works on those questions, and they'll be reported in good time.
You're such a tease. You've been telling us that we have big stuff coming for months and months and months. Can we get a hint? How big? What's the timeline?
Yeah, anything? I mean, I'm not going to play 20 questions. It just doesn't do any good.
With all due respect to the process that you go through to report this stuff responsibly, and I can understand, as I think everybody does here, why you would do so, there are other factors that have inhibited your ability to report these stories. And we're not talking about stuff that has to come from Canadian Edward Snowden. We're talking about stuff that came from Edward Snowden. And your experience, which we've talked about with the Canadian press, has been a little troubled. And you described your relationship, furtive relationship with the Globe and Mail as a difficult one, a bad experience that you had with the Globe and Mail. And you talked about shocking resistance at the CBC for months and months. After a very strong start, when 3 stories were aggressively reported, it's been crickets since then. And you told me that this has to do, and I think we have to get specific here, with a reporter at the CBC who actually was ideologically opposed to reporting this stuff.
Right. Do you want to say the name?
It's Terry Molesky.
So I let him do the dirty work. So, I think it's a mixed bag because, as you said, we did several stories with the CBC in cooperation with Greg Weston, who is a fantastic reporter, and a couple of editors there who were very aggressive and stood really steadfastly behind the story and did not capitulate to government pressure. Each of them left. One of them went to become the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, and Greg left as well. And subsequent to Greg's leaving, we were given a new journalist with whom to work, and this individual seems to believe that mass surveillance is a good thing, which he's entitled to think, I guess, and that therefore he doesn't think it should be reported because he believes Canadians want CSEC to be doing these things and therefore thinks that it shouldn't be reported. And that was the holdup. And the CBC has said, we want you to have journalists who are committed to the reporting, and I feel like we're getting those now. So yeah, there have been problems in the relationship. But let me just say, just so you understand the process, the documents that we're talking about, that we've reported on around the world and that we're talking about now, are, in the eyes of these governments, among the most sensitive material they have. Because it shows how they invade our privacy on the internet. And they don't want anybody knowing, A, how they do it, or B, that they do it. And so when they learn that media outlets are going to report on these documents or publish these documents, they apply extreme amounts of pressure to these media organizations to try and bully and intimidate and scare them out of publishing them. They come and they say, if you publish these documents, you are going to help terrorists evade our detection, and that will cause the death of innocent people, and the blood will be on your hands. Now, good journalists and good editors know that governments say that in every case when they want to hide what they're doing. And so you ignore it unless they have something specific. Not everyone is a good editor and a good journalist. And some people get really scared by those warnings. And that has held up some of the reporting, not just here in Canada, but in a lot of countries around the world.
And in fact, John Stackhouse, the former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, told me that's exactly what CSEC told him, told his office when he was about to release the actual documents, that this was a matter of life or death. And that was ultimately revealed to be bullshit. And those documents came out, but by then public attention had moved on. We're still waiting for that aha moment here. And the ability for the system to sort of correct itself and put things under the rug just today. And I don't want to put everything on Terry Milewski, because let's remember, CBC is our public broadcaster, and for months and months, Terry was their point of contact with you, and nothing was coming out. So I don't know what was happening there. Terry now says to this information you've given me that he was ideologically opposed. He has suggested very strongly on Twitter that that is bullshit, and that the story is bullshit. And can we put that to rest here?
Yeah, except I'll just say that, I mean, you can go on Twitter and call a story bullshit. It's not very convincing. I mean, I don't feel a need to refute that. The story is absolutely true. There's evidence for it. And the proof ultimately is in the pudding that the reporting hasn't come.
I'll follow you up on the evidence. Who are you working with now? I realize I've made things really awkward for you in Canada since you've been here talking to CBC, who I think have trying to kiss and make up with you since what happened. I'm sorry if I made things weird. But who's going to report this stuff with you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I think that, I think I've spent a long time talking about the role of journalists, and I think the role of journalists is to hold people in positions of power and influence accountable, and that includes large media outlets, which play a really significant role. So, yeah, as annoying as you've been the whole week, and as uncomfortable as you made things from my relationship with other journalists, I think you did exactly the right thing, and I'm glad you did it. I think the public has a right to know when media outlets are being bullied and deterred by the government out of reporting, or if there's other corrupting influences preventing the public from knowing. But yeah, we're still working with the Globe and Mail and the CBC, and I think the problems have been largely fixed. And so I hope and expect there to be really good reporting coming soon.
Consistent with this idea of holding powerful people accountable, as the person who has, and not the only person, but as a person who has these files, you are a powerful person. And it's unfortunate that some of the other people who have some of these files are not sharing with anyone, and that is shameful. But because you are working with journalists, these questions fall to you, and that's, I suppose, your burden. So I do have to ask you some questions to hold you accountable. And a question was actually posed by Ron Diebert of the Citizen Lab to me, who said, he is puzzled by the process by which you choose journalists to work with, and that it lacks transparency. I won't ask you necessarily to account for that, but you did tell me in a previous conversation that things are changing in terms of how the Intercept and you are working, because it is a very slow process, especially when we don't have as rigorous and as robust a press in Canada as we do in the States, where there are so many eyes on this so quickly. If you get into a bad relationship with a media source here, then months can go by. But why don't you tell us as much as you can about steps you're taking to make things go a little bit faster?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who don't really have any idea about what the process actually is often voice opinions nonetheless about what it entails, which I think is a natural thing to do, because there is a lot of interest in the story, and so people rightly want more documents to come. The archive that we have is vast and complex, and it pertains to pretty much every country on Earth in ways that take a long time for even the most technically adept people to process and understand. Other times, there are stories that are partially in the archive, but not entirely. And it takes a lot of reporting and a lot of work to piece them together in the right way. I think that what's really remarkable is how many documents we've been able to disclose around the world in the time that we've been able to do it, especially since we have a duty to not just the public to make sure what we're reporting is correct so we're not misleading people, but also to our source who, if Edward Snowden wanted just a really fast and indiscriminate publication of these documents, he wouldn't have needed to come to me. He could have just uploaded it to the internet himself. He came to us and specifically said, I want you meticulously to vet the material and to make sure that every story that's published is in the public interest and doesn't risk innocent lives. And that is a burden I take very seriously, both as a journalist and in my obligation to my source. But we do feel an obligation to get the stories reported more quickly. And so one of the things we're doing, I mean, there are, as you said, big media outlets like the New York Times and the Guardian and the Washington Post who have tens of thousands of documents, and they're just going to hold on to those documents, and maybe one day they'll report them, and maybe one day they won't. What we're doing is we want to put the story ahead of our own competitive interest or our own proprietary interest over the documents. So we've created a system in New York that's almost ready, where journalists from around the world are going to be able to come and work directly with the entire Snowden archive, so that we substantially maximize the number of journalists who are able to work with it and find stories with it and do reporting. And we think that'll expedite the reporting process by letting media outlets have at it, and we think it'll make the reporting a lot better as well.
And just so people can visualize this is sort of like a human-size mini fridge where people cannot download files or make copies of them, but they can come in. It's like a library where journalists who meet your vetting process will be able to come and access the files.
Correct.
And this is going to be debuted soon.
Pardon?
This is almost ready, you say?
Almost ready, correct.
Okay. The word burden comes up a lot, and I can't imagine how your life must have changed and the incredible pressures on you. And you're a new kind of journalist. You are not an institution, though I understand the Intercept is building some institutional facilities, but you're one guy who has become the magnet for, 22 countries you've been in partnership with to report this stuff, all the stuff that isn't known yet. Does it feel like a burden, and are you ready for it to be off your shoulders?
Yeah, the sense, sure, it is a burden when, there's a lot of responsibility to being a principal guardian of how this material gets distributed to the world. You do have the responsibility to make certain that material that might endanger people's lives is reported responsibly. But then you also have this corresponding burden to make sure the material gets out quickly. And then you have a burden or a duty to your source to make sure that the process goes in accordance with the way he asked it to be conducted and that you agreed to. On top of which, there's all kinds of pressures and threats that come from doing reporting like this. There was a long time when I couldn't travel back to the United States because the government was continuously threatening to arrest us. They detained my partner, and there's still a criminal investigation pending in the UK over that. You get attacked and criticized in lots of different ways. But you go into journalism to do a story like this. And I've been working on these issues for a long time, and so the ability to have, first of all, the evidence finally to show that all of this stuff that I've been saying and other people have been saying about the surveillance state actually is true, and you can see the evidence for it now. We can kick a huge hole in the wall of secrecy behind which they've been functioning, is incredibly gratifying. The platform that I have to go around talking about these issues on which I've been working is really valuable to me. And so, yeah, it's been burdened, it's been costly, but journalists around the world have burdens with all kinds of things that they do. It's just the nature of good journalism. I mean, if you say you want to challenge people who wield power, the nature of doing that is that they can do things to you because of the way you're defying or challenging them. That's just intrinsic to the process. And if you're not prepared to accept that, then journalism is probably not the thing that you should do.
And yet, I can almost watch before our eyes the process by which you become sort of suspected of treason and decried, and your character assassinated, and you're a criminal. And then slowly, the stories bear out, and there's a legitimization that happens, and there's the Pulitzer Prize, and then you come to Canada, and all of our top journalists welcome you with open arms. And
well, not all, but
not all.
Yeah.
But you're almost becoming respectable.
I know, it's scary.
What do you plan to do about that?
Yeah, I know. It's it was funny. I was invited to do the Monk debates here in Toronto, I guess 6 months ago.
You're fancy.
And yeah, it's very high end. And I was the two people I was debating were Alan Dershowitz, precisely, and General Michael Hayden, who was the director of the CIA and the NSA under the Bush administration. And I gave an interview to a Canadian-based journalist in Brazil who works for the Globe and Mail, Stephanie Nolan, on the day before I left for Toronto to go and do the debate. And I was talking about this serious crisis of conscience I was having, which is that when you get invited to these kind of events, you're expected to be like very civil, like before the debate they have this cocktail party in this like chandeliered room, and you're supposed to like shake hands with your adversaries and treat them like respected opponents or whatever. And I don't have any respect for Alan Dershowitz or Michael Hayden. I mean, Michael Hayden is, he's a war criminal. I mean, he belongs in The Hague. I mean, truly, like, he implemented a system of torture. And so it does bring up those kinds of conflicts. I actually, it was funny, I gave this quote to her where I said, I'm having a hard time shaking either of their hands because I actually consider them to be two of the most pernicious people on the planet. And the Globe and Mail took this huge profile of me on one page and Michael Hayden on the other, and the quote of mine that they put in the headline was, I'm debating two of the most pernicious people on the planet. And I didn't shake hands with them, and I didn't speak to them, but you do get that conflict. I mean, you want to maintain your outsider status, and there's all these temptations when you do start getting invited into these kind of regal halls where it's expected that you're supposed to change your behavior in exchange for getting admission to these clubs, and that's the process of co-option. And even if you're committed to resisting it, it's a very potent process. And so I think about that all the time.
Hasn't been a problem yet, but I'll look out for that personally. I'm going to take one question that came from our partners at Open Media that was submitted to their Facebook page. And then if people who have questions can start to line up, we'll turn this into a bit more of a conversation with you. Ian O'Sullivan asked a question that I'd love to ask you. Why doesn't Snowden use Facebook? He would be huge on social media, so why isn't Snowden on any of the platforms?
Well, I mean, he doesn't use Facebook because he hates Facebook. I mean, they're like one of the worst violators of privacy, in history. That would be really weird. Nobody should use Facebook. But I have actually encouraged him to use Twitter as a means of having a platform where he can speak. And the reality is that he has one of the really interesting things about the way he's been able to construct his life is, in the United States, the word Russia sends people into these seizures of hysteria still, as though it's 1958. It's always 1958 in the United States when it comes to Russia. And people say, oh, he's in Russia, which means he's condemned to this life of dankness and dark misery. And the reality is that we thought he was going to end up in an American prison for the rest of his life. And although he didn't choose Russia, being there has enabled him to do interviews and give speeches and make appearances and write columns, and he's become a really important voice in the debate that he helped to catalyze. So he's really happy, and there may be one day when he ends up on Twitter.
It seems like he should be out and mixing it up with everybody a little bit more than he is.
Well, it's a little bit difficult when you actually can't leave the country and when the world's most powerful government considers you the #1 fugitive. You've got to be a little bit careful about where you go and what you do.
Sure.
So he tends to live his life online, which, actually before all this happened, before anyone knew Edward Snowden, is what he did anyway. So it hasn't changed all that much for him.
Yes, so we'll get to as much of this as we can. I have a feeling we're not going to be able to get to all the questions tonight, but everyone please keep your questions brief and make sure that they are in fact questions. To the gentleman here.
Hi, Glenn. A lot of Americans I know seem to have drawn a distinction between stories about the government spying on them, which was intensely debatable, and stories about Americans, the American agency spying on other governments, which they kind of expected was happening and they kind of wanted to see happen. And I wonder if you draw a distinction between those two things and how you draw that distinction.
Yeah, I think there's, you can kind of look at the stories in 4 broad categories. So there's stories about NSA spying on its own citizens. Then there's stories about the NSA spying on foreign populations indiscriminately, putting entire populations under a surveillance microscope. Then there's stories about the NSA spying on friendly governments, like the president of Brazil or the president of the chancellor of Germany. And then there's stories about the NSA spying on adversarial countries like China or Iran or Pakistan. There is this sense in the United States, unsurprisingly, that the only legitimate stories are the ones about the NSA spying on their own citizens, on Americans. And we have done a lot of reporting about the NSA spying on foreign populations. And Snowden was once asked about this, and I say all the time, the idea that the only privacy that matters is the privacy of Americans, and that the rest of the world, which, by the way, happens to be 95% of the world that's not American, that their privacy is irrelevant, in fact, so irrelevant that it shouldn't even be reported on, is actually grotesque. And Snowden was adamant from the start that he regarded internet privacy as being the privacy of individuals around the world, regardless of nationality, to use the internet without monitoring an invasion. The debate over the legitimacy of spying on other governments, I think, is a valid one. I do think that the stories about spying on democratically elected leaders of allied countries has been significant, because a lot of people don't think the NSA should be doing that or any government should be doing that. But that's debatable. I pretty much have stayed away from stories about the US government spying on adversary governments, because that, I don't think, is all that interesting. There's been reporting on that for years, and I don't think that surprises anybody. So that's sort of how I evaluate the categories.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, so you spoke a little bit about how intelligence agencies are to some degree insulated from the exercise of democracy simply because people are just not made aware. I mean, short of waiting for somebody to come along and leak documents, how do you suggest that we go about establishing meaningful public oversight over a runaway intelligence community?
Well, I do think public awareness is the prerequisite. And one of the things that has happened in the United States is that there have always been certain avenues that have existed for information to get to the public that the government doesn't want to get to the public. And there has been really a war on those avenues. In particular, I'll give you an example, just a statistic. Under President Obama, there have been now 7 prosecutions of whistleblowers or sources, people who give information to journalists that the government doesn't want out, under this 1917 statute called the Espionage Act, which was designed to criminalize dissent during World War I. In all of American history prior to President Obama, there were a grand total of 3 cases, 3 prosecutions. So he has more than doubled the number just in his 6 years of these kind of prosecutions as compared to every other president prior to him combined. What this is about trying to shut off every valve that exists for any information to get to the public other than the information that the government chooses to get to the public. And information, if you live in a state where the only information that gets to the public is information that the government chooses to get to the public, you live in a state of propaganda by definition. That's what it is. So when you say other than people leaking documents or whistleblowers, what can be done? I don't think anything can be done other than whistleblowers and unauthorized disclosures. There may be other ways to do it. You know, not everybody who leaks to journalists does it by taking tens of thousands of top secret documents and handing them over on a thumb drive in Hong Kong. I mean, sometimes people just call up a reporter and give tidbits of information. But this is a really crucial process to save democracy. I mean, we have to know what our government is doing beyond what they want us to know in order to have democracy be meaningful. And that's why I think defense of whistleblowers and this process of disclosure is so critical.
Thanks very much.
Yes, hello. I would like to begin by saluting your courage and your intellectual honesty.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to salute the absolute humiliation you inflicted on the vulgar Zionist propagandist and Islamophobe Bill Maher on his show Real Time. I may be using harsh words when referring to Bill Maher, but this is what I think of him. I don't know what you think of him. I'd like to know what you think of him.
I concur with your description.
But I'd also like to know that an individual such as him, who presents himself as a liberal and as a progressive, the kind of, and yet shares many of the similar views on American foreign policies as the right-wing pundits in the United States. I'd like to know what kind of influence an individual like him has, or how does he resonate within the liberal class in the US, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, it's a really good but also a complicated question. There was this article today in the Boston Globe by this author who has a new book, the principal point of which was that it doesn't matter who wins elections. The national security state will continue to get its way exactly as they want, no matter who wins. And I know from having gone all over the world, speaking and doing reporting on the NSA file, by far the biggest kind of question that people ask, and it's not even a question at this point, it's more a realization, is, you know, people around the world, everywhere, for a long time, loved President Obama because they viewed him as this vehicle for fundamental change from all the things that they thought had gone wrong with the United States and its behavior in the world. And not just from spying, but from the escalation of drones to the escalation of militarism to just the general face of the United States, people around the world now see that not only has there been no radical change, there's been almost none. And in a lot of cases, it's even gotten worse. And the point of all this, I think, to that realization is that there is almost a full-scale consensus in the American political class, both on the right and the left, about the propriety of these policies and the way in which the US has been conducting itself in the world. So that you even have so-called liberals like Bill Maher, or there's like this new class of, they call themselves new atheists. They're supposedly they're these white Westerners who fantasize about how they're going to lead Muslims out of the bondage of Islam in the name of liberal values and the like, who spend almost all of their time railing against the evils of Muslims in exactly the way, say, followers of Dick Cheney would. And so you have this kind of convergence of conservatism and liberalism in the United States that very much supports this posture of endless war and all of the policies that enable and support it. And I mean, if you look at, for example, Hillary Clinton, who I think most people agree will probably be the next president, she wrote a book pretty harshly criticizing President Obama. And she didn't criticize him for bombing too many Muslim countries. She criticized him for not bombing enough. And almost all of her criticisms of him were that he was too dovish and too peace-oriented and not being willing enough to use violence in that part of the world or not steadfastly supporting Israel. So there's this consensus. You shouldn't be fooled by Democrat versus Republican or conservative versus liberal. You're absolutely right. They share this common theme. And I don't think Bill Maher himself is influential. I just think he's mouthing the kind of ethos into which he's connected.
Thanks very much.
Okay, I'm really, really nervous. I like looked through the room like a dozen times to make sure that no one I know is here. So, first, also, John Cook used to follow me on Twitter, and I think I had him convinced for a long time that he was going to be charged for extortion for his involvement with the crack video. So if you see him, just tell him I say hi. And
does he still follow you, or did he block you?
No, he eventually unfollowed, but only, probably just because I tweet mostly about girly stuff. But, so I was working on Karen McCribben's Liberal leadership campaign. She ran against Justin Trudeau, which I tweeted you about, but I'm not sure if you got a chance to read it, because it was a lot really disjointed. But, and I won't go into all the details of it, but basically she worked in over 70 different countries. She had worked on dozens of classified missions. She worked at NATO, and we just could not get her any press in Canada at all. It was like a Trudeau machine, and it was the most devastating thing I've ever been a part of, because she put up $80,000 of her own money to try and run it up against Trudeau, and if we could have just got out the March 3rd deadline, we might have actually had a shot at pulling in maybe people who would have voted Conservative to vote for her. Anyways, while I was working on her video, my video editing software was hacked, and it ended up being hacked by a Chinese. I'm still not sure if it was Chinese government or it was Chinese IP address, or like it was a Chinese IP address, and that's all I know so far right now. And I still haven't turned the hard drive over to the RCMP because I don't know if I should yet. But long story short, I'm now actually on bail for harassment for something totally unrelated. So I guess my question is, who do you think spies more, the police, domestic police? Because in my trial's actually coming up in January, and I'm going to find out a lot more, but I actually found out that some of the stuff they did, even in my case, since the Supreme Court has now ruled that you're not supposed to be getting IP addresses directly from the service providers. I guess, in your experience, have you found that the police themselves, domestic police themselves, are more pervasive in terms of their spy techniques, or the federal levels or national levels? You know, it actually, thank you, for that question, because it provokes what I think is a really important and underappreciated development, which is, people who have been writing about and talking about what we call the war on terror for a decade or so have been mostly condemning certain kinds of abuses that have been perpetrated by the US and its allies in other distant parts of the world aimed at foreign populations. And one of the things that you see very kind of rapidly now is the importation of a lot of these, what were war on terror policies, into how the government interacts with its own citizenry domestically, at least certainly in the United States. So if you look, for example, at the NSA's mass surveillance program, that was actually a program that was pioneered in Baghdad, aimed at an enemy population, that was then brought onto US soil. If you look at drones, which were once flown exclusively over places like Yemen and Somalia, police departments in the United States, and actually I believe in Canada as well, are now using drones for surveillance. You saw that protest in Ferguson, Missouri over police brutality, where Americans were shocked because there were these tanks on the street. That's paramilitarization. What used to, the kind of force that American police departments used to use, or that militaries used to use against foreign populations, are now being used against the civilian population. Once you start to endorse this mindset that certain kinds of policies are acceptable, aimed at bad people, it's almost inevitably the case that it will be brought into the domestic realm. So if you endorse the idea that agencies can go around the world invading people's privacy and spying on them at will to stop bad people from doing bad things, there's no reason why that will ultimately not be brought into your own country and aimed at your own domestic population. And I think you see that on almost every realm of the war on terror.
Thank you. I think we have to be out at a certain point, so we're going to take 2 more questions. So to the next 2 people, and to the rest of you, I apologize, but Bill Owen will tell you, Glenn's pretty good in terms of following up with people. It's pretty accessible. So yes, please.
Yeah, hi. During the Wednesday attacks, I walked all around Ottawa, downtown, as far as I could, as close as I could get along the police lines and so on, Stuck around most of the day, and about 2 in the morning, I did a selfie-o, which is a selfie video, and I was talking about misguided fear, terrorism versus climate change, because climate change is the issue that people, if people understood the threats as much as the scientific community is starting to, they would realize that climate change is the issue that is not going to go away, and the extreme weather events that are causing $6 million or $1 billion of damage in Calgary, $1 billion in Toronto, you know, this is only going to get more frequent, more extreme. So could you search through your files on climate change and release all that information sooner than later?
Do you have files?
You're getting a little taste of what my life has been like for 16 months. You have over here somebody demanding that I release files on one topic, and then somebody over here demanding I release them on a completely different topic. We have done some reporting on climate change, including spying on climate conferences where countries got together to negotiate accord. But you know, I would say 2 things. One is, I think it's important to understand, and I realize the temptation is to just close your eyes and fantasize about what you wish would come in the world and then assume that I have it and then just that I can release it at any moment. But you know, Edward Snowden worked in one particular agency of the US government in one part of that agency and was taking documents illicitly. You know, he had to take them where he could get them. And so he took a lot, but he didn't take documents on every topic. And you know, I guess all I can tell you is if there were documents that were relevant on climate change, they would have been reported on already. The other thing I would say is, you know, I think we should be careful about ever saying this is the issue, because there's short-term harms and there's long-term harms, and how you weigh, you know, pervasive starvation or children suffering from lethal diseases that are curable against climate change, I think is difficult. But I agree with your core point completely, which is that human beings are very bad at evaluating risk. I know, you know, people in the United States, I know them personally, I mean, who like walk around petrified about the terrorism threat, and yet they text all their friends while they're driving. And it's like, you know what, that is so much more likely to kill you than terrorism. But you know, I think one of the things that you see, and I think you see it this week, and I tried talking about this a little bit with a couple of people in Canada, and it's hard to talk about, but we are tribal creatures. And what terrorism does is it triggers this tribal instinct in us, which is that we collectively, our group, have been attacked. And you know, I think that's why you see lots of Canadians who are very well-intentioned and not at all giving into hysteria, nonetheless doing things like waving Canadian flags and talking about it like it's an attack on democracy. It's the reason why terrorism is so susceptible to being manipulated, because it's this othering process. There are these other people who are outside of our society, who are different from us, who have attacked us collectively. And that's a really powerful instinct that we as human beings have for all kinds of evolutionary reasons. And that's why we respond to it more than, say, the distant and scientific threat of climate change, even though from every metric, rationally, climate change is much, much more threatening. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we have to guard against, is this kind of deliberate manipulation of the makeup of our instinct and emotional constitution, because that is how we get led to evaluating the world irrationally. And I think you see that this week.
Thanks very much. Last question.
It's a pleasure to be able to ask you a question, Glenn Greenwald. I've been following your work ever since Snowden, shortly after he arrived in Hong Kong. My question actually is about love. One of the things I found remarkable in reading over some of Snowden's statements, I think in the Guardian article called I Spy in particular, he talks about love. He says, I don't want to live in a world where we can't express love, creativity, and have relationships online. And this struck me as really out of place, coming from a person who's very intellectual, very brainy, and very nerdy, and who talks about encryption a lot and uses a lot of abstract terms to talk about what he's doing. He doesn't very often get to the heart of things. But this sort of struck me as being the heart of his motivation, and I wonder if maybe you could just say a few words about that. I know it moves a long way from the political, but I think it's at the heart of our political relationships with each other, is our relationships, our friendships, our ability to be creative in the public sphere, to do what we're doing right now.
You know, that is, yeah. That is, you know, I think it's profound, and I also think it's incredibly insightful about Snowden's motivations in a way that's not easy to apprehend. And I mean, that is a fascinating topic to me, and I'll just, for the moment, say that I gave a TED Talk, I think a month ago in Brazil, which you can find online really easily, where I talked about this idea that if you're not one of the bad people, the people plotting terrorist attacks or engaging in violent crimes, if you're instead a good person, like a person who goes to work and comes home and raises your kids and watches TV, that you're not doing bad things, and therefore you don't have anything to hide, and therefore don't really care if the government is invading your privacy, because you don't actually think they're really interested in what it is that you're doing. And I talked about the critical central role that privacy plays in the lives of all of us, and not just people who are doing bad things like committing terrorism and the like. And when I was in Hong Kong, as I said earlier, it was critical for me to understand the motive that led Snowden to do what he did, because I wanted to make certain that I wasn't participating in unraveling somebody's life who hadn't given extremely careful and deep thought to why this was worth doing. And I asked him many, many times over the course of hours and then days for this explanation. Why was this worth it to him? I mean, he had a very stable life. He had a girlfriend who loved him. He had a lucrative career. He had a family that was supportive, a great life in Hawaii. Why was he willing to throw this all away in pursuit of this abstract political ideal? And he gave me a lot of answers that weren't quite persuasive to me until he talked about what you just raised, which is he said that growing up the way he grew up, which was pretty poor, he didn't even finish high school. He grew up in this very cloistered suburb in Northern Virginia near the kind of military-industrial complex, that he had a very kind of narrow world. And the internet is what let him explore not only the world, but other people and ultimately himself. He could speak to people around the world with whom he would never otherwise communicate. He could experiment with ideas that he would never be willing to express if it were attached to his name. He would try out different personalities and identities, all of which was possible exclusively because he was able to do it in a realm of privacy. And he said he didn't want to live in a world where that was lost. He wasn't willing to live in that world. And the reason that was so important to him, and it's something that I've given so much thought about over the last year and a half, is because as human beings, and there's all kinds of scientific studies that demonstrate this to be true, but I think our own human experience proves it even more. When we think that we're being watched, our behavior changes radically. We become much more conformist, we become much more compliant. We make choices that are the byproduct not of our own agency, but of the expectations and mandates of social orthodoxy and convention. And it's really only in this private realm where we can explore intimacy and, as you say, love and friendship and different ways of thinking and being and creativity and dissent. It all exclusively resides in this realm of privacy where we can act without other eyes being cast upon us and making judgments. And that is something that was crucial to Snowden's evolution as a person. The ability to have this private realm online where so many people, especially younger ones, don't just buy books and make travel reservations, but develop who they are as people and make human connections. All of that is severely crippled, if not completely destroyed, when we live in a world of mass surveillance, where the internet is converted into a place where we can always be watched and monitored. And that's what makes what you said so insightful is, yeah, he talks about encryption and he talks about surveillance technologies, but ultimately it was a deeply human perspective that drove him to do what he did. Deeply noble and selfless, because he wanted these connections that can be made exclusively in a world where there's privacy to continue to flourish, and he knew that's what was being destroyed. And that, more than anything, I think is what drove him to do what he did. So excellent observations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I can't think of a better place to leave it than there. On behalf of this audience, and I think I'm going to go ahead and say on behalf of Canadians, I want to thank you not just for being here, but for shocking us into awareness. And I'm going to speak on behalf of Canadian journalists, and they won't like that, but I want to thank you for challenging us to reinvigorate ourselves and rediscover our courage and our purpose in this country. Glenn Greenwald, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thanks, that was excellent. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.